And I feel that ultimately we can't summon up any more enthusiasm for this rather boring couple. And I feel the best thing we can do is leave them in Montecito. And when the inevitable divorce happens, then he might well return to this country with his tail between his legs. And she will publish her own very, very successful memoir.
Hello and welcome to The View from 22 for Spectator TV. I'm William Moore, the Spectator's features editor. I'm delighted to be joined today by Alexander Larman, the literary editor of Spectator World, the Spectator's American edition, and the author of The Windsors at War and the star of the Channel 4 series of the same name. He joins me today to discuss whether David Beckham deserves a knighthood and all things royal in 2024. Alexander, thank you very much for joining me.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back.
Alexander, this week you've written an excellent piece for the Spectator's website about the question of whether David Beckham deserves a knighthood. For viewers who may not be aware, why is this debate back in the news and what's it got to do with the Qatari state banquet?
Well, it was noted the other evening that both David Beckham and Victoria Beckham were very prominent guests at the Qatari state banquet, which is being hosted at Buckingham Palace. And David Beckham has been spending an awful lot of time around the royal family in the last year or two. And he's an ambassador for the King's Foundation. He's doing air ambulance fundraising with Prince William. And he's quite a ubiquitous presence. And what a lot of people have been saying for some time is, why doesn't David Beckham have a knighthood? That's quite a fair question to ask, because he's probably the best known sportsman in this country. He's done a lot for charity. He's a figure who has an international reputation. And there are people less worthy of knighthoods, sportsmen, who've received them. So at first glance, it's a very good question. Why isn't he Sir David Beckham, or indeed Sir Golden Balls, as he was once so notoriously known? Unfortunately, Beckham does not have an unblemished reputation. There was an incident in 2013 where he was involved in tax. I think the term is tax avoidance schemes, but it was all entirely legal, we have to note. But nonetheless, there was a sense of Beckham somehow being a bit tarnished by this. And then his reputation really plummeted in 2017, when it became very clear that he really wanted a knighthood. There were these emails leaked in which he essentially said, why didn't I have a fucking knighthood? Catherine Jenkins has got an OBE, and all she did was sing at some soldiers and put some coke up her nose, which I thought was quite funny, actually. I mean, if I'd been on the honours committee, I'd have given him a knighthood there and then. I thought, yeah, fair point. But unfortunately, the honours committee tends to work in quite arcane and quite secretive ways, and so I think it's fair to say that Beckham's probably tapped on the shoulder and told, look, if you want to be Sir David Beckham before you're 50, you've really got to work hard for it. So he's been in the honours equivalent of the salt mines over the last few years. And talking of salt mines, one of the reasons why the Qatari connection is a slightly controversial one is that in 2022, Beckham was out doing quite a lot as an ambassador during the World Cup being staged in Qatar. The problem is, Qatar doesn't have the best human rights record. And just because they are investing quite a lot of money in this country and they are seen as our, in inverted commas, friends and allies, most people are not blind to the appalling things that are going on in this country, which has no attempts at democracy. It has no attempts at any kind of freedom of the press or freedom of expression. And so I think that while I have mixed feelings about our royal family associating itself so closely with the Qataris, I mean, I feel there's a very good argument for saying that the state visit was not a brilliant idea. David Beckham associating himself so closely with Qatar and the royal family, you're thinking to yourself, you really want that knighthood, don't you, Dave?
Well, he is quite close to the royal family, isn't he? I mean, you point out in your piece that he's quite personally friendly with quite a few royals.
Well, he's one of the few people to have been good friends with both Prince William and Prince Harry, and it's often been said, if there's ever going to be a rapprochement between the two brothers, and hell looks more likely to freeze over than that happening, it might well be Dave who sits them down and says, "Nah, come on, lads, let's chat things out," or whatever he would be saying in his inimitable way.
Yes. Well, let's talk about the wider royal family now then. So we last sat down to talk about the royals in July of this year. And even then, halfway through the year, we were talking about how this is been an extremely difficult year for the royals, the most difficult in a very long time, arguably. Now we are at the end of 2024. What's your analysis now?
It's been a rotten year for the royal family. There's no other way of putting it. I mean, the first half of the year was worse than the second half has been, but very little good has happened because, I mean, there's been issues of ill health dogging nearly all of its members. I mean, even, the Queen's ill health over the last few weeks, she's had bad pneumonia, has just contributed to a sense that things are not working as they should. It's been very interesting over the last few years because ever since Prince Harry announced his quasi-abdication at the beginning of 2020, the institution has had one seismic shock after another. There's been the Harry saga, there's been the Harry and William fallout, there's been the death of the Queen, there's been the publication of Spare, and now this year there's the unbelievable announcement that the King had cancer, that Kate Middleton had cancer, and that there's a real sense of the institution just having these blows after blows after blows. And the problem is that people feel sorry for members of the royal family, they feel sorry for the King, they feel deeply sorry for Kate. But sorrow isn't really what the monarchy needs, because we should always see the monarchy as an institution above us, that is somehow timeless, that is dignified, respectable. I mean, that's why the old adage, never complain, never explain, is so true of a monarchy. And I feel there's been a lot of complaining, a lot of explaining. I mean, and I feel that by now, people are getting a bit, not weary, but there's a sense that it's almost like we're watching the seventh season of a very, very, very long box set. And people are thinking, okay, perhaps it should have been cancelled a season or so ago. Perhaps actually we've seen all we need to see. The characters are getting less interesting than they used to be. Unless a really good new character comes in the next season, we're not sure we're going to keep on watching.
So what does the royal family need to do then in 2025? Obviously, there's big things completely out of their control, such as all the health issues that you just mentioned. But what could the institution do differently if they want to reclaim some of that favour with the public?
You can get 3 months of The Spectator for just £15, plus a free bottle of Paul Roger champagne if you go to spectator.co.uk/fizz24. This offer is UK only and subject to availability.
What I feel that the King has done very well on occasion is to convey a sense of both dignity, but also a commitment to the country, because one thing his mother was never very good at was giving a sense of genuinely understanding ordinary people. I mean, the cliche that we always use of her is her saying in her impeccable RP, "Have you come far?"
Yeah.
I feel that the king is actually much better at talking to people and at connecting with people. And I feel that what his advisors and people around him need to do is to let him be a bit freer. They need to let him be somebody who can speak his mind a bit more. I mean, which may or may not go well. But I think people would warm to him a lot more if they saw the unvarnished Charles, because he's quite an extraordinary man. I mean, he's very clever. He's very erudite. I mean, he's the cleverest person to have been king in an exceptionally long time. And I feel sometimes that he's quite stymied because he is expected to behave with these very narrow parameters. And people talk about his irritability and, of course, the way in which he can get quite riled, to which you say, well, if you're in your mid-70s and you've been suffering from cancer, I think you're allowed to feel quite tired and irritated a lot of the time. But then, of course, there's the question of what do you do with a wider royal family? Because, I mean, something that we haven't mentioned yet is the Duke of York. And he has been eviscerated in not one but two different shows this year, both of which explored the fallout of the Newsnight interview with Emily Maitlis. And the thing about Andrew is he's like a pantomime villain. I mean, he's this figure who people can often say, if it weren't for the privilege and wealth of the royal family, he would have found himself facing, the full force of the law. I think that's a very good way of putting it, because he's got this very strange existence at the moment where he's living in this royal lodge house, which is now being paid for by person or persons unknown. There are these big, big question marks around Andrew, around the fact that he is still being on some level supported, he's on some level being kept safe by his family. And I think that there is a great sense in public of people saying, well, actually, you, this institution of a royal family, have to be above suspicion, above normal codes of conduct, if you are going to retain your integrity. Having an obvious bad apple at the heart of it like him is never going to go very well.
Something we touched on in July last time we spoke about all this was the fact that Harry and Meghan have become quite a bit quieter actually this year. We don't hear as much about them. We don't hear as much from them. Have we now totally peaked on Harry and Meghan drama? Do people not even care enough to hate them anymore?
I'll give you a story about this. Harry's paperback edition of his memoir Spare has come out. I didn't realise it had come out. I haven't seen it in the bookshops. There's been no talk about it. There's been no extra chapter. There's been no update. And for a book that was at one point the highest selling non-fiction publication of all time, to come out in paperback and just to be met with a kind of meh, is really telling. First of all, about the way in which I don't know if he refused to write another chapter, he refused to update the story, because any publisher would have said to him, please supply more material, please do another chapter about the outcome of what happened when Spare came out, please say about your life, please say about all this. And he clearly didn't do it. So we've just got this rather standard book coming out. But also, I think we reached peak Harry last year. I think we reached peak engagement with this rather silly, rather selfish, youngish man and his ghastly and vapid wife. And I feel that ultimately we can't summon up any more enthusiasm for this rather boring couple. And I feel the best thing we could do is leave them in Montecito. And when the inevitable divorce happens, then he might well return to this country with his tail between his legs. And she will publish her own very, very successful memoir.
Well, one thing we have to look forward to next year is the next in the Netflix documentary series, which we are being promised is going to be even more unmissable than the first, if such a thing is even possible. But I mean, what is there left to say at this point? I mean, surely it can't really shock anymore.
That's what it's like to do a sex tape. But apart from that, I cannot actually think of anything that they could produce on Netflix which would be anything other than the usual dreadful, boring, self-indulgent toss, to be quite honest with you. And I think that people can see that, because Harry and Meghan were seen as 5 minutes, as the future of the royal family. They were seen as youthful, multicultural, politically quite woke, right on, left wing, whatever you like to call it. And there was a sense that even people who rejected the royal family as republicanism could see them as the kind of royals you can get behind. But what they've done, quite successfully but inadvertently, is to reveal that they are just as vapid as everyone else. They're just as lacking in principle, and it's chasing the money. And Netflix, Spotify, all the rest of them, they are getting bored because they haven't produced the goods. I mean, that awful series that they did in 2022, it never cut through to the public imagination, because essentially you've got hours and hours of whinging. A lot of people can just get that from their mother-in-law. You don't actually need to have that on television.
Well, finally then, Alexander, what else could we expect from 2025 when it comes to the Royals? What predictions would you care to make?
Well, I would suggest that after a very, very bad year for the royal family, there'll be a lot of talk about resets. There'll be a lot of talk about trying to engage in mission-led parameters and stuff like that.
Oh, God.
And actually, there'll be probably... No, genuinely, I think we'll be sitting down with Keir Starmer's team and talking about how can we try and make the royal family relevant? What can we do to give more of a sense of people understanding what we're doing? I don't know if that's going to work or not, because the royal family is not a government. It is not something which is voted in every few years. It is an institution, and it's been a very battered, rather careworn institution over the last few years. And I don't know. I mean, sometimes I feel like we need less royalty in our lives. Sometimes I feel like if we didn't hear the royal family from one week to the next, it wouldn't be a bad thing. But then on the other hand, if you stop with that, then what's the point of them? And I think that's a question that a lot of people have been asking over the last year and will continue to ask.
Alexander, thank you very much indeed for joining Spectator TV.
Thank you, Will.